Good evening, everyone. My name is Ryan Burrows, Executive Director of the American Kratom Association. It is a pleasure to welcome you all. We have a great legislative update for you this evening. And on our panel this evening, we have David Carlucci, Senior Advisor of External Affairs. In addition, we have Jeff Laredo, former Senior Policy Advisor with NIDA. And I'd like to kick it off with Mac Haddo, our Senior Fellow with the association.
Thank you, Ryan. And maybe just to start off, to give you a report, we're in the sort of the middle to the tail end of most legislative sessions that are going on in the states in 2022. We entered this legislative season with a better pathway for discussions with legislators because we don't have COVID for the most part in the way. Some states have still continued to have lockdowns, but for the most part, we've been able to have discussions. Thank goodness for Zoom and technology like this, because it's facilitated a lot of great discussions. I would put the current status of our efforts for promoting the Kratom Consumer Protection Act into three buckets, essentially. You have states that are going to require a 2-year cycle to complete a review of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. Some of them because of at the start of it, the referrals to committees and the timetable in some of these legislative sessions requires that. For example, in Hawaii, it is literally a 2-year process to get it through. We've had the bills introduced, great sponsors, the Speaker of the House and the Senate President, but the actual education of those legislators is going to take some more time. We have some other states like Texas and Arkansas and North Dakota that are not in session this year. And so that's obviously going to be a delay for us, but we're working in interim committee sessions, informational sessions, and educating those legislators along the way. So we have those states where it's just a cycle. That's true in I think in Connecticut, New Hampshire, we're going to be working through next year, the session to get this through. The second bucket of states are those states where we had bans that were introduced. And we saw that, for example, in the state of Washington. We were able to educate the sponsor of that ban in Washington, and he has agreed and did file the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. But because of the timetable for the filing of that, that's going to be a next year evaluation, and then the interim discussions over the summer, educating the colleagues. But the most important thing is that he recognized that the ban was not the proper solution along the way. So that was great. We saw a similar thing occur in West Virginia. We had a member of the Senate who filed a ban bill, listened to us and said, okay, I'm going to strike my bill and I'm going to do the right thing here. And we're looking forward to the Kratom Consumer Protection Act being sponsored next year in the West Virginia Senate. We saw the same thing happen in Kentucky. And all of these are derivative. And I think Kentucky is a great example where you get constituents who call their members and say, this stuff should be banned. And they're relying mostly upon either a personal family experience or what the FDA says, or a combination of those things. And so we went down and met with the representative, Callaway, who had sponsored the ban. He was an engaging, delightful person to meet with. He was interested and open to finding out what the truth was. And he now is sponsoring the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. So we see that working. And there are other states like that. Now we have a ban that's proposed in New Jersey by a perennial legislator who perennially sponsors a ban, and he's not going to change his opinion about it. But we do have the KCPA that's ready to be actually being introduced into that state. So there's those states where you have ban and hopefully conversions and that kind of thing. I'll give you an example of one that was pretty interesting, and that's Mississippi. A great lobbying team down there. You have an impassioned group of advocates who want to protect the access to Kratom so that they can responsibly use it. And then you have a group of very active anti-Kratom and anti-drug communities that are working hard to try to ban it in localities around Mississippi. It's a very active group, and they're pushing hard on the Mississippi legislature. And there's an interesting bit of information out of that and a lesson that we can learn. And that is that the truth will prevail. And in the state of Mississippi, despite that push by these well-organized, well-funded, and completely erroneous complaints about kratom were resulted in a failure for the ban to be enacted. And I think that we made tremendous progress there in educating the legislators so that the opportunity for the Kratom Consumer Protection Act will be available to us next year. Now, the third bucket are those states where we're actually either completing a 2-year cycle or in the first year, we're getting traction through. Examples of that in the state of Oregon, the legislation passed. It is now at the governor's desk. The governor committed last year that if a change were made to the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, which passed last year in Oregon, to assign it to a regulatory agency that was less controversial to the FDA than the Department of Agriculture, that she would sign the bill. And so we expect in the time period allotted for her to review bills within the next 3 weeks, we're going to see the signing of the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. In Missouri, we got through the House in Missouri at, I think it was 113-9 or something like that, an overwhelming margin, which is pretty consistent when we're able to educate legislators. I was just there this past week for a hearing, and in the Senate General Laws Committee, it went terrific, well understood. It now goes to the Senate floor. Now, it's interesting because of redistricting, which is our COVID. I mean, the redistricting battles that are going on in these states are really difficult. In the state of Missouri, there are very few House bills that have been made it out of the House and into the Senate because of this redistricting fight. And so apparently the Kratom Consumer Protection Act is going to become the Missouri omnibus bill. They're going to load up all kinds of bills on the KCPA. And that's a threat to us because if it gets too big and too overwhelming, we may not get passed. But we've got our fingers crossed. And on the merit of the issue, there's no question that Missouri is going to be a great state for us. In the state of Kansas, we passed the House. It's now before the Senate. I participated in the hearing. The Department of Agriculture, who last year, before it passed the House of Representatives in Kansas, testified against the bill. This year, they went to neutral because they're understanding it better. They're seeing the opportunity that's there. Same was true in the state of Colorado. We had the hearing before the Senate Finance Committee. We're now in an education mode in dealing with the state regulatory agencies that don't understand that you don't have to regulate kratom like marijuana. And so they've set up a meeting with the Utah Department of Agriculture that's been successfully regulating kratom there for 3 years. And so we're encouraged that those kind of discussions will lead, hopefully, to a complete passage of the KCPA. We're seeing progress in some other states. Michigan's looking great. We've got a hearing scheduled in Rhode Island, which is a banned state. We're making progress in those areas too. There have been some disappointment, and Ohio is a great opportunity for us as well. And Tennessee, there's a bill that I'm headed there this next week, to talk with the sponsor of a kratom bill that really needs to be revised into the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. It's a bill that limits the quantity that you can buy of kratom in a single package. So a part of an education process. Now, we've lost some battles, and I say lost, it's temporary loss. Florida, I think next year we're going to get the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, but in Florida, it was stopped for political reasons that had nothing to do with the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, and a dispute between the House Speaker and the Senate on the legislation, other piece of legislation, and we got caught up in the backdrop. That happens sometimes, and we just have to realize that that's part of the process. So that's another example of where we continue to prosecute these battles and educating the legislators, and we use the grassroots teams where it's appropriate to do it. So, and there are other states I've glossed over. Louisiana has a ban in that we're trying to reach out to the sponsor to see if we can educate him. We've got some other pockets of flare-ups that we need to deal with. So we're going to continue to work on it. We rely strongly upon all of the grassroots teams to help us to be activated. And so that's an important part of what we're doing. And those that weren't able to join, we had a call with Pennsylvania residents earlier. It's an example of what can happen in a community. You have a small township that in Radnor, Pennsylvania, that had an application for, or actually had a retail store open up. And they had not filed for the local permits that were required. And it was like a flashpoint because they said, oh, well, that store is going to sell kratom and CBD and Delta 8 and all the other substances that, of course, generated some opposition in the community. And we got wrapped into a much larger discussion about other substances that are dangerous. And we know that the safety profile and the addiction profile based on science doesn't justify the banning of kratom, which is what some of the local activists have taken up as their cause célèbre. But we're educating those folks. And the Radnor Township Board of Health declined to ban kratom. They're going to let it go to the Board of Commissioners in the county or the township. And we've been communicating with them, and we're hopefully educating them in a way to allow for that township to properly regulate kratom, and certainly at a statewide level to do it. I'll invite David Carlucci to kind of describe what we're doing in Pennsylvania, because I think it's a good example of how we continue to work, and then we'll come back and I'll finish off with some other details here.
Well, thanks, Mac. I'm David Carlucci. It's great to be with everyone. Many of you know I'm a former state senator in New York, and I've been working in Pennsylvania to set the foundation to get the KCPA introduced. And I've been working with a few lawmakers, in particular, Representative Tracy Penny Cook, who is a veteran herself and who has really been interested in kratom. Once she understood really who was consuming it, why they were consuming it, what it did for people. And so many times these problems, as Mac had talked about in this municipality, can turn into an advantage. Obviously, it's a problem and we have to deal with it head on. With that said, it also highlights that, hey, kratom is completely unregulated in Pennsylvania, and the concerns that many people bring up at the meeting, although factually incorrect, their concerns about selling to minors and the possibility of adulterated products, things that we talk about all the time, are true. And it highlights that, hey, we need to do something about it. And so we often find that sometimes our harshest critics can be turned into some of our biggest champions. Many of you know, I started off very concerned about kratom 6 years ago when I introduced a ban bill in New York. And luckily out of that, I started to hear from consumers, from advocates that said, Senator, you can't do this. It's helped me. It's changed my life. But if I was only going off of what I saw from the FDA, which at the time is what I was doing, then I would have been led down this road to say, okay, we need to ban it. And that's why we need to be vigilant. We need to be respectful of lawmakers and decision makers and even advocates that are against us and say, hey, we need to ban this substance. And the reality is that they're often lacking so much information. And that's our job, to make sure that they are educated. But of course, when you're dealing with these highly charged emotional issues, it is hard to find that common ground. It is hard to find a doorway in where we can find that rapport and speak intelligently to each other. So that's something we have to navigate. But I feel that we have, this is a challenge here in this municipality in Pennsylvania, but it's also an opportunity. And we're going to be continuing to work with our sponsor. And we've been picking up co-sponsors in Pennsylvania to make sure this gets done. The advantage we have in Pennsylvania is that their session does not get cut short like many of these other states that Mac had mentioned earlier today, that their session lingers on throughout the year. So we have an opportunity to get this across the finish line this year. And with these flare-ups, it also gives that opportunity to say, hey, lawmakers need to do something. They need to take action. So I'm excited about that opportunity in Pennsylvania.
Thanks, David. And let me turn it to Jeff. Jeff, so everyone knows that whenever we get invited to a hearing, sometimes we're allowed to invite experts to come in and participate, and we welcome that. That's obviously where we want the discussion of the centers on the science. And so you'll see Dr. Henningfield, Jeff Laredo, who's a former senior policy advisor to the director of NIDA, the National Institutes on Drug Abuse. And we find ourselves sitting in front of legislators who are grilling us on these issues. And Jeff's been with me on a number of these states where we've been through those experiences. And I think it'd be great for him to kind of give you an idea of the kinds of reactions that we get and the experiences we have in some of these legislative hearings. So Jeff, I'll turn it over to you for a couple of minutes here.
Well, thanks, Mac, and good evening, everyone. What I'm thinking about, Mac, is our very recent experience in the Colorado Senate. We clearly had a situation where members of the committee, there were a couple of members of the committee who clearly had done their homework. and were very interested and had a lot of really good, well-informed questions, and that was great. There were a couple of other members. It's not that they hadn't done their homework, but they were simply less educated on the issue overall. In fact, Matt, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the chair of the committee had just become the chair of this committee, the Senate Finance Committee, a week or so before we had an opportunity to testify in front of her. I thought that she was terrific and very engaged and all, but she didn't know as much as she probably wanted to know herself. What I found interesting, not everybody gets an opportunity to testify in front of either the Congress or their state legislature. You get very little time to state your case. Hopefully you get people interested enough so that they'll ask you questions so you can talk some more. In our situation when we were in Denver, each of us had 3 minutes to speak. I would invite all of you on the call tonight to speak for 3 minutes. You can't say a lot in 3 minutes. Between Dr. Henningfield and Mac and I, we had a total of 9 minutes. So you can make your point, but it's still pretty challenging. One of the things I want to remind all of us, ever since I've been working with all of you since late 2018, we spend a fair amount of time and energy quite correctly criticizing the FDA for the work they've done in this space. I want to remind us that we can't just criticize them. And the reason I say that isn't because they're doing the right thing for us or with us, but the FDA's got a really broad array of responsibilities. And if we're the folks who are somewhat wildly basically saying, well, the FDA is worthless, well, what about COVID? What about all of their medical review responsibilities? What about all of their food safety responsibilities? I'm not suggesting that they are in any way doing a great job across the board, but we need an FDA or a similar federal agency that we can trust and that we can look up to, and that we can, at the very least, not just complain about. And I say that because that occurs to me every single time I criticize the FDA. I spent 30 years as a federal policy guy. And so for somebody like me to spend a lot of time criticizing the FDA should get people to sit up and take notice, because that's not what people like me want to do. We want to be applauding the FDA for high quality, science-based work. And that's why all of you and you hear Mac stressing the science. You hear me and David and everybody stressing the science and research, and while there's more we need to know, we know so much. And I say this because it's easy for us to take pot shots at the FDA and other folks. But when we talk to these state legislatures, what people paid attention to when I testified in Denver was when I stressed what we know from science. And that's the way I said it. We know this, we know that. The chair actually, her head actually popped up and actually looked at me for the first time when I said that. And that, you never know exactly where that's going to go, but that's important. And given that we're fighting these battles all across the country, we have to keep those kinds of things in mind. So let me stop there, Mac.
Thank you, Jeff. In terms of challenges that we're facing, the most important thing is we want accurate information to be presented to state legislators, and it ought to be science-based, not emotion-based. One of the biggest problems we run into today is this debate that's going on between the people that lost loved ones who in their hearts believe that Kratom was responsible for those deaths. And then they engage and interact with the Kratom advocacy community, and it creates conflict. I will never be able to convince the woman who called me an effing murderer in promoting Kratom that Kratom wasn't the responsible substance for her mother's death. I won't convince her of that. I don't think that if she read every scientific article that was read by Dr. Giroir, who evaluated the FDA's safety profile on Kratom and its addiction profile, and made the decision that it was based on disappointingly poor evidence and data, that Kratom was not schedulable, That wouldn't convince her because there are emotions that are simply too intense when you lose the loved one. And I can also tell you that on our side, we have to be very careful of overstating our case. And I've been guilty of it. When I first started out, I was touting the fact that the NIDA research concluded that there was no significant addiction liability to kratom. Now, what the underlying issue there was that you can, in fact, become dependent on kratom, just like you can on caffeine and other substances. And so it's not accurate to say from a scientific perspective that you cannot become addicted. There's not a significant addiction liability. And that word significant means something because from a scientific basis, we recognize that the common consumer of kratom could become dependent on it. And the question then is, what's the withdrawal profile of kratom? Since it's not an opioid by chemistry, by nature, or by legal definition, what is it? And we know from the science that you have a much milder withdrawal experience from kratom than you do from opioids. In fact, that doesn't characterize it properly. You have a dramatically different thing. And that's why Johns Hopkins University came out with their survey of adult kratom consumers who reported that 87% of those consumers said that they actually relieved their withdrawal symptoms by using kratom, and 35% were opioid free within a year by replacing that opioid with kratom. So that's a very powerful data point that can be used, but we can't overstate it. Can you overdose on kratom? We have not yet seen any evidence of there being an overdose of kratom. We have evidence, scientific research that shows that you have a 1,000 times greater chance of overdosing on opioids than you ever would on kratom. Does it mean that you absolutely cannot overdose on kratom? No. We know that there are many commonly ingested substances that if they are not used appropriately or they're abused, will cause a death. Water is a perfect example. Senator Kurt Bramble from Utah frequently cites the fact that a family in his district, the parents were convicted of manslaughter in the death of their daughter because as a form of punishment, they forced her to consume a large quantity of water in a short period of time, upset the electrolyte balance in her body, and she died. A tragic thing. But you can't say that you can't overdose on water. I might intuitively say that, but it's not scientifically valid. So we just have to qualify our views here. And what we know about the science is that it doesn't meet the standard for scheduling. We know that. We know that's been true in 2 separate submissions that were tested by the DEA and HHS of the FDA's claims about kratom in its safety profile and addiction profile. We know that the FDA took their case to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which has a far lower standard for scheduling internationally than we do here in the United States. We saw that the WHO Expert Committee on Drug Dependency, 12 independent scientists that looked at all of the evidence, every bit of it that the FDA submitted, and other health agencies who parrot what the FDA says from around the world, and they concluded on 11-to-1 vote, there wasn't sufficient evidence to move to even a critical review of kratom, which would have involved a year-long research into it. They didn't even meet that standard. So as much as the critics of kratom may want to claim that it is dangerous and that it has this addiction profile, which is unacceptable, and it's unsafe, the science doesn't document it. And we on our side simply have to qualify our statements to say responsibly used and without the products being adulterated, kratom can be safely consumed. And the safety and addiction profile are what they are on the science along the way. I said earlier, and one point I want to make before I get to this next point, I'm reading the comments, and Misty said it would be nice to know if that we had a KCPA sponsor in West Virginia. I do not want to get sideways with Misty. I may have misstated that. What I accomplished in West Virginia was the state senator who had sponsored the ban on kratom agreed to work with us and may actually sponsor next year the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. So if I misstated that earlier, I apologize because I don't want Misty mad at me. But to the next point, which I think is important, those people that are of a mindset and who believe that kratom is a dangerous substance, I have repeatedly invited them to come and we'll host a webinar and we'll have a reasonable discussion. What I think is unfair and I think inappropriate, is for them to sit behind a keyboard and launch these unjustified attacks on kratom that are not supported by good science. And I know there are people on this call here that are part of that community. I understand that if someone has lost that loved one, that they're not going to listen to me, but that doesn't give them the right to spout their opinion as though it's a fact. And it does not allow them to misstate the science around kratom. Now, a lot of people say, well, this is all justified because I have my local medical examiner who made the decision that this was a kratom intoxication death. And we have invited every single one of those deaths, for those that we aren't able to gather yet through official channels, to submit those. And we're gathering a database to evaluate all of this. We're having an expert forensic toxicologist independently review the autopsy reports. Now, the reason we're doing that, because we want the truth. We want family members who lose a loved one to know the truth as well. And if it's true that kratom was responsible for that death, we want to have that as an input into the scientific research that's being done to do it. We have independently funded research by academic institutions about the safety of high doses of kratom using the FDA's oxycodone protocol. And you're going to see the results of that study published here in the next month or so, which will contradict any of the claims being made by the kratom critics about the safety profile of kratom being too dangerous. And that goes right to the FDA's argument as well. So we're working with people, and we invite those critics. And I'll say it again, don't be a coward, come and talk about it. I'm doing it publicly. We'll host the webinar, whatever it takes. Bring your best arguments and your best experts along the way. But the Centers for Disease Control is their evaluation of medical examiner reports of kratom detected in the tox screens of deaths is the very best kind of science that gives us some basis for looking at these tox reports, because in those cases you had 90 plus kratom detected tox screens of decedents. And when they evaluated that, they found that there were, I think fentanyl was the top adulterant that was in it, or a substance that was commingled with or taken concomitantly with kratom, buprenorphine and morphine, and then cocaine went down. So what that tells us is that the fact that kratom was detected in those 90 plus deaths doesn't mean that kratom was the cause of the death. In fact, it supports what the National Institute on Drug Abuse concluded: there's polydrug use. And again, not surprising, kratom might be used along with these other drugs if people are struggling with addictions and the associated problems with opioids. They might be using kratom to get off of them, and they're just in that transition phase. Now, we believe that some of those products, based on recently published literature that just came out in the last couple of days about case hit studies of adulterated kratom products causing people to be in ICUs. And we suspect that maybe, well, we know that some deaths have been reported that were in fact adulterated kratom products. So that has to be factored in as well. The CDC report did say at the end of the day that there were 7 deaths reported by the medical examiners that were kratom only. And that goes to the heart of this issue about people, our critics say, well, that's proof positive that kratom is deadly. Well, actually, when the CDC took those 7 deaths, there were 6 blood samples sufficient for testing, and they applied more sophisticated analytical tools and more modern equipment, which is far too expensive for most medical examiners to have locally. And they applied those tests. They found that of the 6 for which they had sufficient blood samples, all were polydrug use. So even the 7 that were identified by medical examiners didn't pass the rigorous test of actually being the result of a kratom-only death. And the one that was left wasn't sufficiently available, but statistically, I think it's safe to say that that wasn't kratom only itself, because of the way that they've done this kind of testing. So that's why this scientific foundation is very important in the evaluation. And when we make our arguments to state legislators, this is a simple equation. We simply tell them, rely on the science, protect the people that are currently purchasing kratom products in their state where the KCPA is not in effect, or where a ban is not in effect. And we tell them that they should protect those consumers from the adulterations that occur by unscrupulous vendors who are doing it for the money. And the FDA actually recognizes this in many products where there is deliberate adulteration in order to enhance the economic benefit of an adulteration manufacturer that's spiking their products. We know that kratom is not a good candidate for people consuming so much of it in order to get to a point where you might have a health problem with it, because it's too expensive to do that. If you're looking for a high, you can go get it much more cheaply on the street corner from other substances. But nonetheless, we are very interested in the science. We're making significant investments in the science. I referenced the safety study that was done earlier. We have ongoing scientific projects that are working on it. And we specifically welcome any of our critics to engage in this discussion, because we want to learn from it. And hopefully you can learn from us as we have these discussions going forward. That's what we're seeing. So you can ask questions in the Q&A button at the bottom. There are 2 questions that have been asked so far, and I'll respond to them. First is, if the KCPA is passed in all states, will the FDA be out of options for trying to get kratom banned? Under the Federal Controlled Substances Act, the FDA has to apply to the Department of Health and Human Services, and under an agreement that they currently have, which I don't think that they're too happy about, the National Institute on Drug Abuse has to sign off on the addiction liability section of the 8 factors that are involved. The FDA has tried that twice. If there's something that changes in the future where the scientific basis for the FDA to make a credible argument for the scheduling of kratom, then it could be scheduled at a federal level, despite the fact that maybe 30 or 40 or 50 states have passed the KCPA. Because if a substance, including kratom, meets that standard, it's going to be banned, and it supersedes any federal or state level legislation on this. Now, I have heard people, and they appropriately point out that that CBD is for those CBD products that are THC derivative of the hemp products with marijuana, that they're technically federally banned, and they are. There's no question about that. So that's been sort of a hybrid of what the states have done, because CBD is sold in every state in the union, and there are many states, I think around 40, that have actually passed regulations about CBD that allow for it to be used. So I mean, it's just and the same is true with medical marijuana, federally banned substance, but yet the states have taken action. That's why kratom, even though it's not banned federally, we know that the threat of the FDA to continue to fill the pipeline of disinformation that influences public health officials, law enforcement officials with their nonsense, that we have to continue to fight this battle. So all the states in the union could pass the KCPA and the FDA if they can convince HHS and the Drug Enforcement Administration and NIDA that they're right, then potentially could be banned. We don't see that because the science is pretty doggone clear. Second question is, we had this FDA executive who was caught telling the truth about the incentives at the FDA. That was very interesting theater. It is the opinion of one FDA high-ranking official. It undermined the credibility of the FDA, which may account for part of the reason why there's such a low trust level of the American people in the Food and Drug Administration today. I think a lot of that's derivative of the overall problem with COVID and the various responses by the FDA, but certainly it didn't help their case. I don't think it's going to be determinative to anyone. Those that were with us, critics down on the Hill of the FDA, they loved it, but it's not going to move the needle, in my opinion, with too many people. It might have gotten some of the fence sitters to kind of tip our way in terms of not making the FDA into the holy grail for all public health matters along the way. Then the question is, do we have to worry about NIDA leadership changing their stance despite the science? My hope, and I think it's probably a high level of trust, that a person that gets appointed to be the NIDA director is largely going to be driven by science, not by personal opinions. And I think that the investment that's been made by the current director of NIDA is evidence of the fact of the search for the truth. Because when Nora Volkow first started down this path, she looked at 2 studies that were done independently but concurrently when the FDA first made their claims in 2017 in their second submission of the high addiction liability of kratom, and she wanted to know the truth. And so the science came back conclusively. There was not a schedulable level of addiction liability with kratom. And in fact, they showed in both studies a reduction in the cravings for the reference drug morphine. That was powerful. That's a scientific piece of evidence that then was the catalyst for NIDA to invest significant amounts of money now in ongoing studies that are revealing even a better safety profile for kratom than what we knew back in 2016. And in fact, it's instructive to look at Dr. Jawad's comment in his letter when he rejected and withdrew the FDA's recommendation in 2018, when he said that there is emerging science that contradicts the FDA's position. And from 2018 to today, there's been over 100 new peer-reviewed scientific research articles that document that the position that we take on kratom is absolutely right. So I'm confident that we're going to see a NIDA director continue to follow that science, irrespective of which political party is in power. And by the way, the NIDA position is not a political one. It's one that they really look for qualified people.
Matt, can I add to your comment on that?
You may indeed.
I worked for Dr. Volkov for 14 years. There is no chance, zero, that she could or would be swayed by what any of us might be considered political, for political reasons on this or any topic. She is militantly science only all the time. And my experience at the NIH, I worked at NIDA and I worked at the Alcohol Research Institute. My experience for my entire career at the NIH, that really is what the scientific leadership across the agency is all about. That doesn't mean that there are never politics, small p politics. You know, it's a big organization, it's a government organization. But never say never, but Mac is absolutely right. You know, they are laser focused on trying to figure out what there is to figure out. And whether it's Dr. Volkov or whomever might succeed her down the line, and quite frankly, she's got a great gig. I don't see her leaving that job anytime soon. But I don't think that that's going to be an issue for us. We have plenty of other issues to worry about. I don't think that's one of them.
Yeah, good. Thank you. And I think that's a great perspective, Jeff. You were there and saw it. And, it's an interesting thing. There's a question about, has there been any progress in educating Secretary Becerra? When Secretary Becerra was questioned by Congressman Mark Pocan about kratom, he made a very interesting and what I thought at the time was an alarming comment. He said, well, I understand there's a controversy about kratom, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, we rely on the FDA and they're driven by the science. And I cringed because in fact, they're not. You can make whatever argument you want to make about the FDA. They have a group of people that are in their policy arm that have waged a war against dietary supplements, herbal supplements, and natural products for decades. And it's not just kratom, it's about any of these kind of products, which they would much prefer, and they feel better about the safety for the American people if those products are forced into the new drug application pipeline. So we were concerned, and Congressman Pocan was equally concerned. So he has been engaging in a dialogue with Secretary Becerra, and we continue, as you point out here on the question about Secretary Becerra being educated. I think that as he becomes more familiar with this issue, and interestingly, Senator Mike Lee of Utah and Congressman Pocan specifically wrote when the FDA made their attempt at the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs to have kratom scheduled, they objected. And they wrote a letter directly to both Secretary Becerra and our UN ambassador and said, there's no way that the FDA should be weighing in with the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs advocating for the scheduling of kratom when they can't meet the criteria here. And so I think that got the attention of Secretary Becerra. I know that in his initiative that was announced in October about opioid prevention, that he's cognizant and aware of the science that's already in about the benefits of kratom, the health benefits of kratom, particularly for those that are struggling with addictions. And if we're looking for a harm reduction measure that will help people, then I think we're going to see it in kratom. And I think that his staff is becoming more attuned to it and informed about it. And so I'm encouraged by this. And I think that that as we continue down this path, particularly with both the Senate and the House, with their report language talking about kratom and how it should be not be banned and available to the public, and there should be more research into kratom, that I think Secretary Becerra will respond to that, and certainly his staff will, and that will help us along the way. So I think, thank you for that question. I think it's very important along the way. A couple of states, and maybe folks didn't hear the earlier thing, and I did not include, by the way, Illinois. Illinois is part of that 2-year cycle. We got the bill introduced. We have great sponsors. They had a issue with redistricting that kind of blew up their session. And so we're looking to next year to follow through with the passage there. And in Colorado, the question is, any more available information on the Colorado resistance? We have a what I consider to be a dilatory response from the regulatory agency in Colorado, where they oppose the KCPA, and they do it in a fascinating way. They say, well, we want to take 18 months or longer to study what we should do in the regulatory framework for kratom. Now, that presumes that kratom A is a schedulable substance, is a dangerous substance. And so that simply isn't accurate. And or it presumes that this is not a product that's being sold in the state of Colorado today, and they have to somehow protect the consumers by not allowing it. It is being sold in Colorado, and unfortunately, some with adulterated products. And I saw a commentary of a person who reported directly on an adulterated kratom product manufactured with a specific vendor in Colorado, distributed throughout Colorado, that is threatening the health and safety of the people of Colorado. When I met with the regulatory agency, I made that point. This is not a substance that is not in Colorado today. It is. And it's adulterated products are in Colorado. So what is the best public policy? Do we wait 18 months or 24 months in order to evaluate what the regulatory scheme is? No, you act now. And if you want to look at best practices, look at the state of Utah, which is right next to Colorado, which has had 3 years of experience. And they actually accepted that. The Department of Revenue said, and I've arranged for them to have a meeting with the Department of Agriculture in Utah tomorrow. So we're working with them. This is part of an educational process. I'm distressed by the reaction in Colorado, because the idea that you would want to not regulate a product that protects consumers to assure that they have safe products and let it be the Wild West. I don't understand that thinking at all, but this is the way some government people react, and pretty interesting stuff. And by the way, just as an aside, Governor Paulus, when he was in the Congress, signed the letter in 2016 telling the DEA not to schedule kratom. So how in the world can the agency that he now is in charge of be advocating for delaying for a reasonable regulatory pathway to protect consumers to ensure that they have access to safe kratom products? A little strange to me. So I'm hoping that we can continue to work with them and hopefully get this legislation through. Senator Janal, who's our sponsor there, concurs completely with this analysis that we need to protect consumers. And if you want to give the regulatory agency 12 months to figure out how to do it, that's fine. But we certainly put in the regulation now that you can't sell in the state of Colorado an adulterated kratom product. So that's the bottom line there. Now, that's all the questions that I've seen on the question and answers. If anybody has any, you ought to throw them up quick. Let me conclude, and then I'll turn it over to both David and Jeff to give their comments. This is an effort that, from a grassroots standpoint, that we're all engaged in, and I salute. And I have been together with advocates for kratom that tell their stories, these wonderful stories about how kratom has improved the quality of their life, and in some cases saved their lives. When legislators hear those stories and they couple that then with the science, that becomes a powerful driver to good public policy. And we're seeing that happen across the United States. And it isn't happening as fast as we would like, but it's happening. And every time we make a progress towards this goal, it has influence on other states, because these legislators are looking to other states to see what they're doing. And so when we get these great approvals in Oregon and in Missouri and in Ohio and in Michigan, and we continue to make progress in Kansas, we're just doing great work here, and we're going to continue to fight this. And when we're able to educate legislators about proposed bans that are inappropriate, and we're able to defeat them, then that is another testament to the message and the fact that all of you, as advocates, are your story is important along the way. We are the American Kratom Association that represents consumers. We cooperate with and work with vendors who are willing to be compliant with the GMP standards that assure safe products are manufactured and sold to consumers. We cooperate with them in our GMP program, but we are just as tough on those that are adulterating or making illegal therapeutic claims. We've referred over 60 kratom companies who are marketing products making illegal therapeutic claims to the FDA over the last 18 months. we're working hard to protect the consumer marketplace. We applaud the companies that make that commitment. We encourage consumers to look at our website and buy those products, not the ones that are out there in the middle, not the ones that are not compliant and that you're at a higher risk if you purchase those products, even if they're cheaper. And that's something that's important. I get it that if you can buy a safe Kratom product cheaper than what you can buy it, but there's a reason why it's cheaper in the most part. And that is that if you're a company that's engaged in the production of a Kratom product and you don't have to hire the staff in order to be compliant with GMP practices, and it takes some investment in that, and you're not willing to invest in the equipment that's necessary in order to produce a safe product, then you shouldn't have unfair competitive advantage because you don't do those things and you're not willing to test your product, because that's expensive too, then you frankly shouldn't be in the marketplace. And so that's something that's really important to do. And you juxtapose that against the powerful testimonials. And look on our website, you see a SEAL Team 8 guy whose life was literally ruined by opioid prescriptions that were given to him for the pain of the injuries he sustained while protecting this country at the highest level possible. And his life was ruined. And he found a way back by using Kratom. That's a powerful story. You have Laura Romney out of Utah, who was one of the first testifiers, and she has this very rare trigeminal nerve pain damage, and she found relief from and full functioning back into being the mom and the wife and the employee that she had before she suffered from this terrible kind of disease. Look at all of those, and then you see the advantage of what we're doing. We're protecting people, their right to safe Kratom products, and that's what we're all about. So that's the bottom line. So let me turn it to David and then Jeff, and then we'll wrap this thing up.
Well, thank you, Mac. Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight in this late hour. Your passion, your energy, and your commitment to seeing Kratom safely accessible is what drives all of us and makes our job possible. When we're there in the Capitol and we're talking to lawmakers, what really does it is those personal stories, is hearing about what's really happening. And nothing does that more than someone that a lawmaker knows. And you really never know when that story is going to influence someone and how it's going to influence someone. So my biggest recommendation is to pick up the phone tomorrow, call your state lawmaker, whoever it is, make sure they know your story. Because as a lawmaker for 10 years in New York, I can tell you nothing really motivates a lawmaker more than hearing from their own constituents. Of course, there's tactics that we use in trying to get our issues addressed when we're lobbying. And of course, there's political considerations. But at the end of the day, what really motivates people, and on this issue, that's the most important. Mac's been in thousands of meetings on Kratom, and I've been on so many meetings. And the biggest obstacle we have is that lack of information. And when there's lack of information, that's when people have fear. And when there's fear, they just want to say no. And I think that's the biggest observation that I've made in this effort, because we know that we're on the right side, that we need to regulate this product. And in doing so, it will help millions of people across the country. And the problem is that lack of information. So people are scared. And that's why you can help, because if we don't have a contact with a state lawmaker, they don't want to listen to someone from the American Kratom Association. They want to listen to a resident in their community. And that has been so tremendously helpful. We've got so much momentum at our back. Mac mentioned some of the disappointments for us this year, but we see them as temporary setbacks, like Mac talked about in Florida, in Wisconsin. We're hitting some snags, but they're political in nature. And now we've made our case. We've been able to educate lawmakers, and we think when we have the opportunity, we're going to be able to pass these bills. So we've been able to file bills in the majority of states in the United States. We've got some great momentum, and I believe that this year is going to be a banner year for us when all is said and done, getting these bills passed and making a major impact in moving this issue forward. So I'm just excited to be working with all of you, and I thank you for your support and look forward to some great news in the upcoming weeks and months.
Thank you, David. Jeff.
Thank you. Obviously, I support everything that Mac and David have said. The combination of personal stories and what we know as a fact from science and research really you've heard all of us say that a lot, but it really is crucial. That really does seem to be certainly what lawmakers around the country and policymakers around the country have responded to. The only thing that I'll add to that, a lot of advocates in the kratom community also advocate for kratom from the perspective of it's a natural product, therefore it is good. I want to remind all of us that we know it's good because of personal experience and because science and research is giving us a lot of answers. The very fact that something is natural does not make it a good thing. There are plenty of natural things that are bad for us. So I would, while we're riding this positive wave, let's also remember, stick with what we know. And what we know are how many of you and your colleagues across the country have benefited from using this product. And what we know is what the science tells us. If we stick to those two things, we will win state by state and eventually nationally.
Thank you, Jeff. And then let me just finish. There's one last question. It's actually a great one, and it kind of culminates, or at least consolidates some of these thinking. The question is, should there be any concern about the increasing number of kratom products that are available that are innovative, and they include flavorings, 5-hour energy-like bottles and mixtures, and it obviously is attracting more attention. And so here's my view on this. I mean, I personally would rather that the industry slow down a little bit on these innovations. But I've always said that the most important thing is that when a kratom product is introduced by a vendor, that it's safe. And as long as there is any additive to the kratom product is not a controlled substance or anything that enhances the effects of kratom so that it creates a different effect than the natural kratom, then I think it's fine. I think the caveat to that would be, and I know that it gets a lot of attention, that if the product is designed or the packaging is designed to be attractive to minors, I think that's a no-go. And we vigorously would oppose those kinds of innovations. And the product could be, for example, in the shape of a gummy bear. That's not the way to do this. That is attractive to minors and it will get the attention of state legislators. But if it's in a round form, and seniors like me have to take these different forms and get access to them, childproof packaging is important. Now, there's a flip side on the seniors and say, well, that makes it harder for seniors to use it. But it's been accepted as a practice, that childproof packaging along the way. I think that the best marketing of a kratom product today is in its pure form. If there's some innovation that allows it to be more creatively marketed, but the form should be a pill, a capsule, a powder, or a beverage extract that meets GMP standards and that uses extraction methods approved by the FDA using food-grade solvents. And then anything that innovates beyond that should be carefully done, and it doesn't increase the target on our backs. I think there'll be an explosion of kratom products when we finally get the FDA to regulate rather than try to ban. I think that when we improve our mainstreaming of kratom and we beat back some of these bans that have forced us, bans in the commercial establishments, so that it's back in GNC stores, so that you can buy it at Walmart, so that you can buy it on Amazon, then I think we're going to be able to mainstream this product, and educate an educated consumer base is going to be able to make intelligent decisions along the way. I share the concern about these new products, given where we are in the policy battle going forward, because we need to first get mainstream before we take too big of strides forward. And there's a big appetite for vendors to say, how can I produce a product that will attract more consumers to my bottom line, right? And they're in that business. I get it. The one last thing I don't like the packaging that is deliberately or whether it's, well, it clearly is designed to appeal to minors. We don't need to have that kind of packaging. And so I think that's another issue that we need to be concerned about. That said, thank you to everyone that took the time to be with us tonight. Thank you for your voices. And thanks, frankly, to our critics, because we welcome this debate. We welcome the discussion. We welcome an open discussion, not one that's hiding behind a keyboard, taking pot shots on social media and making claims that, that you only can make because no one's going to challenge you. Again, I reiterate my commitment. We'll have an open forum discussion. Glad to do so. We'll bring the scientists in, whatever it takes in order to educate people in a responsible way. We're willing to do it. We want to respect each other, respect our critics, but respect us too. That we have in this particular case, a substantial body of evidence that documents that kratom does not meet the scheduling criteria under the Controlled Substances Act. And just because the FDA doesn't like products like kratom is not the basis for anyone to demonize it and say that it's therefore something that should be scheduled, because we know what the FDA has done is created an echo chamber. And we know that they have this disinformation campaign. And I talk to state legislators all the time, say, oh, well, I Googled it and I found that Mayo Clinic doesn't like kratom. They think that it's unsafe. Well, Mayo Clinic has not done one piece of independent scientific research. They only repeat the FDA line. Same's true with WebMD. Although it's interesting, if you look at WebMD, they actually have a section of their website where they talk about the health benefits of kratom. They buy into the argument that there is no approved medical use, meaning a new drug application. That's true. But that doesn't mean that a product can't be on the marketplace. There are thousands of consumer products that are on the marketplace today that have no approved medical use by the FDA. The FDA misleads people when they make those kinds of statements and act like that they are indictments against kratom. Kratom is not a new drug application. And if it is, then it's got to go through that process. And only then can a vendor make a health claim that's associated, a therapeutic claim that's associated with the product. That's the criteria. Same's true for dietary supplements. If a kratom product is marketed as a dietary supplement, which is under the law, it's legal to do so, they can only make the associated structure function claims, which will enhance their sales, if they get a new dietary ingredient notification that's been filed with the FDA and not objected to, and they go on the marketplace. So we support those things. We support them completely. But for our critics to say, oh, well, you don't have an NDIN, or you don't have a new drug application, that has nothing to do with whether kratom should be marketed or allowed to be marketed in the United States to consumers, for informed consumers to make intelligent choices about their health and well-being. So with that, I conclude and just tell you again, thank you for everyone for your participation, for joining us here tonight, and for adding to the discussion. We're deeply grateful to you. So Ryan, I'll turn it back to you.
Now, if there's any other questions this evening, I just thank you, Jeff. Thank you, David. Thank you, Mac. Incredible information this evening, quite candidly. And let me just check our Q&A. I don't see any updates here. No, and just great support from our vendors on the chat as well. So thank you, gentlemen, and we really appreciate it. Please reach out to me directly. I am going to type my email in quickly in the chat for those that don't know me. And if I can answer any questions, please reach out to me directly. I will get back to you very quickly. Otherwise, I believe we can end our meeting if there's nothing else.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you.